Welcome to the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers 2024 On-Farm Network Research Results. I'm Chris, On-Farm Network Agronomist. I'll start by mentioning the results booklet. Flip open the booklet to the green MPSG tab. 2024 trial results will always be on the left-hand page, and on the facing page has the long-term results summary. Page numbers are in the top right corner of the presentation slides, and they will correspond to where each trial type can be found in the booklet, so you can follow along. Reminder that all on-farm network trial participants receive their individual single site reports via email, but you can also find them or any other on-farm network trial on our website and go to the On-Farm Network Research Reports database. I'll now remind everyone how to read a single site report. You'll have the trial name at the top, a brief summary of the trial, key trial information in the table. You'll get a nice NDVI image of the site, precipitation table, yield results, and the economic analysis will always be on the second page. Other trial types, such as fungicide trials, we conduct disease ratings, and that will also be included for depending on what trial you've conducted. So in 2024, the On-Farm Network established and completed 58 trials. We had 36 soybean, 18 field pea, and 4 dry bean trials. Unfortunately, no faba bean this year, but hopefully next year we will get some. Since 2012, or the beginning of the On-Farm Network, we've had 577 trials involving with 4 crops, involving 210 different farmer participants. We operate all across Agro Manitoba, but you can see most of the dots are happening in the Red River Valley. And this is simply because all of the crops are being grown in this region, where, for example, in the west, there's more peas, but less dry beans and less soybeans. But we hope to move more trials out west and north as time goes on. So this is the 2024 research trials broken down by crop. I'm not going to be able to touch on all of these trial types today, but you can see all the trial results in the results booklet. And I just want to highlight that the On-Farm Network is very much a team effort. We're out there all summer long collecting data, and this hands-on work really allows our agronomists to learn what's happening on the ground level, which builds our knowledge so that we can pass this knowledge on to the farmer. Starting in on trial results from 2024 with soybean seeding rates. This is by far the most popular on-farm network trial of all time. Given the high seed cost, farmers are really interested in reducing their seed input costs. So we have 2 main questions. Can we reduce input costs? And what is the effect of changing seeding rates on yield? For the trial, we're comparing the farmer's normal seeding rate to 30,000 seeds per acre lower and higher. And there should be a minimum of 30,000 seeds per acre difference between the treatments in order to see a good effect. And we had 12 seeding rate trials this year, with 2 of them being significant yield responses to changing seeding rates. In the graphs, we have the different seeding rates tested going along the side, or along the bottom rather, and the 3 different rates, and then on the side we have the yield. In the graph on the left, this is one trial. The higher seeding rate of 217,000 seeds per acre yielded significantly more than the lower seeding rate of 144,000 seeds per acre. But the 2.2 bushel per acre yield increase was not economical because it was still not enough to cover the extra seed cost. And there was a loss in profit of $6.50 per acre. This is assuming a seed cost per unit, which is 140,000 seeds, of $63 per acre, and a soybean selling price of $12 per bushel. So on the right graph here, we have another trial where the yield increase was of 3.3 bushels per acre and it was the higher seeding rate compared to the lower seeding rate that caused the yield increase. And so this resulted in a increase in profit for $12 per acre for the farmer. So in the trial on the left, the most economical rate was still the lower rate. And on the trial on the right, it was the higher rate. That was the most economical. Since seeds is expensive, we measure seed survivability in these trials, and that would be the number of seeds put in the ground that become viable plants on the 3 different seeding rates. And in the trials where we had significant yield gains for the trial in the left-hand table, the highest seeding rate, or rather the highest seed loss, was actually the medium seeding rate. And for the trial in the right table, there is a trend towards more seed loss as you go up from the lowest rate. And this is similar to our long-term data of seeding rate trials, where we have seen the percent survivability decrease as the seeding rate increases. Economically speaking, in 2024, 11 out of 12 trials resulted in a loss in profit where increasing rates was not economical. And the lowest seeding rate was the most economical. So for each 30,000 seeds per acre increase, it costs $13.50 more per acre. And we've had a whopping 132 soybean seeding rate trials since 2012. 16% of the time we saw a significant yield response to increasing the rates, but only 11% of the time it was economical. To put it another way, 84% of the time, raising or lowering the seeding rate from the normal practice did not change the yield. And I want to note that 60% of these trials were completed with an air seeder and 40% with a planter. So recommendations for soybean seeding rate: lowering the plant stand can be economical, but lowering it too much can be risky. You want a bit of a buffer if emergence is low due to challenging conditions, and a low plant stand decreases the crop's competitive ability with weed. Evaluate your plant stands every year, and the medium seeding rates of 140 to 160,000 seeds per acre is still the best management practice. Perhaps there's areas to improve establishment. Examples could be getting the seed depth even across the drill, or tweaking your residue management. On to soybean row spacing trials. We had 5 soybean row spacing trials this year, and we're asking 2 main questions. What is the effect of different row spacings on canopy closure and on yield? And just want to know, we don't complete economic analysis on this trial type because of how the different row widths are achieved and be very farm and equipment specific. This year we had 2 narrow row versus intermediate row spacing trials and 3 intermediate row versus wide row trials. Narrow rows are 7.5 to 10 inch, intermediate are 15 to 20 inch, and wide are with the 30-inch rows, usually accomplished with the planter. Typically with narrow rows are with an air seeder, and wide are with a planter, and intermediate is using a planter and going in between the 30-inch rows to achieve 15-inch rows. In order to properly assess row spacing agronomics, seeding rates were the same between the different treatments. Firstly, what was the effect of canopy closure at the start of flowering, or R1, at the beginning of pod, R3, and at the beginning of seed, R5? Percent canopy closure is found by using the Canopio app, where it simply calculates the percentage of an image that is plants. There were no significant differences in canopy closure between narrow and intermediate row spacings at any stage, but intermediate rows had 11% more canopy closure at R1 and 8% more canopy closure at R3 compared to wide rows. By R5, the canopy was the same and pretty much closed in for all the different row spacings. So to picture this, see the image on the left. There are 30-inch rows, and there's a lot more black, which means soil, than the 15-inch row image. So the intermediate row spacings have more canopy closed by R1 and R3 than wide rows. and this is positive for weed competition. In 2024, we had one trial where the wide rows yielded significantly more by 3.2 bushels per acre than the intermediate rows. A quick reminder, we do not calculate economics on this trial, but this result goes against the long-term trend, where we have seen that the intermediate rows have improved yield over wide rows. Our summer student Ashlyn this year did her summer project on disease incidence and severity on these row spacing trials. She compared common soybean disease incidence and severity between the different row spacings. And you can see all the diseases that she rated in the table. I will note that of all the soybean diseases, white mold has the most potential to limit soybean yield, and Ashlyn found no white mold symptoms in any of the fields. So her results, she found no significant differences in disease severity or incidence between the row spacings except septoria brown spot, where there was a lower severity in the wide rows than in the intermediate rows. Now the long-term trials, we've conducted 26 row spacing trials since 2019. 12 were narrow rows versus intermediate rows, and 14 were comparing intermediate rows to wide rows. Narrow rows significantly improved yield over intermediate rows about 1/3 of the time, increasing yield by 1.8 bushels per acre on average. And intermediate rows improved yield over wide rows about 1/5 of the time, increasing yield by 2.5 bushels per acre on average. Overall, 3/4 of the time, changing row spacing had no effect on yield. But one key finding we found is that from using the Canopio app, the narrow and intermediate rows close in earlier in the season compared to wide rows. So our recommendations on row spacing, soybeans may be successfully grown on any row spacing, but the data is showing there is a greater yield potential when going narrower than 30-inch rows. Yield responses to changing row spacings may not occur on every field every year, but the competitive advantage of a crop closing in earlier in the season is important to mitigating the development of herbicide-resistant weeds. Moving on, we had one trial this year comparing an iron chelate fertilizer called Soy Green to untreated in soybeans. A chelate helps the iron stay in the plant available form. We wanted to know what was the effect on IDC, or iron deficiency chlorosis, where the plant goes yellow and can negatively impact yield, and what was the effect of the soy green on the yield. Soy green granules in the picture right, they actually look like coffee grounds, were applied in furrow with the seed at a rate of 4 pounds per acre. They cost about $28 per acre, and let's see if it worked. A field is considered high risk for soybeans developing IDC when the soil test shows a high concentration of soil carbonates and salinity, and this field had high levels of both making it high risk to IDC. The variety seeded was a food grade variety with an IDC score of 2.2 or semi-tolerant. And sure enough, with the high rainfall this year and on a risky soil, we saw lots of interveinal yellowing starting at the V2 stage. For visual IDC ratings, we use this NDSU rating scale where 1 is a green plant and 5 is basically dead. At 3.5, there is chlorosis as well as necrosis, and the plant becomes stunted. We started our visual IDC ratings on June 26 at V2 and went back every 2 weeks later, stopping at R3 when the plants largely grew out of their IDC. Peak IDC occurred around R1 to R2, but for a field average, severity stayed moderate, never going above 2.3. There were some patches that stayed yellow and stunted and never recovered. And we did have a range of scores anywhere from 1 to 4, where some plants looked really necrotic and stunted. but we saw no visual differences in IDC ratings between the treatments. And something else, Ian, on-farm network technician, captured images of this trial at each rating visit with a drone equipped with sensors for things like NDVI. He's still processing all of the data from multiple drone flights. Ian can tell you how many terabytes of data he collected. In the image on the left, under drone ratings, you can see our ground ratings interpolated on the trial map, and on the right is the NDVI imagery of the same area. The goal is that somewhere in between these, we hope to develop a method of using a drone for IDC ratings. We think that this will be faster and more accurate, and we are learning a lot to hopefully apply this technology to complement current data collection methodology. Again, no differences in treatments, visual differences, that is. So the iron chelate yield result, we saw no significant yield response to soy green versus untreated. As a result, there was a loss in profit of about $28 per acre for the cost of the product. Despite the moderate IDC symptoms, the yield was actually pretty decent, over 50 bushels per acre, and with a food grade bean price, all the better. And long-term soy green trial results, we had 6 soybean trials in 2016 and 2017 where liquid soy green with the seed was compared to untreated. And then we had the trial from this year, but there were no significant yield responses to soy green. Studies have shown that soy green can help to mitigate IDC, but for Manitoba, we don't have enough data to be able to determine the probability of a response to the product. No more research is required. You should soil test and use field IDC history to determine risk, and identify your fields with low IDC risk. But the number one strategy for managing IDC is choosing the most tolerant variety available. Consult the 2024 MPSG Soybean Variety Guide. Moving on, I'll quickly go over soybean biological trials. We had 8 biological trials in 2024. 6 were Invita versus untreated, and 1 tested primacy alpha versus untreated, and the other one was Invita alone, crop aid alone, and crop aid plus Invita. And there were no significant yield responses in 2024. For soybean biological products, since there are many different claims from improving soil health to higher yields, at this time we don't collect yield. We only collect yield data. Started testing soybean biological products in 2019, and we've now had 33 trials with 12 different products. Almost half of those were involving Invita. We have had no significant positive yield responses to any biological product, resulting in a decrease in profit from $5 to $28 per acre. All right, jumping into field pea inoculation. We had 1 inoculation trial this year near Lenore, testing a double to a single inoculant strategy. Double was liquid on seed plus granular, and single was just liquid on seed. And the farmer wanted to use 2 inoculant strategies this year because the peas were planted on this field at least 15 years ago. In the first graph on the left, the nodulation score on the side where 0 to 5 scale, where 5 is more nodules and 0 is less. There were no nodulation differences between the strategies. The yield graph is on the right, but we saw no difference in yield either between the treatments. 3 trials since 2021 resulted in a loss per acre of the granular inoculant. There have been no differences in nodulation score. But you should always inoculate your peas with the correct strain and consider double inoculation on first-time pea fields. Switching gears here now, from now on in, I'll only talk about fungicides because it was such a big story in 2024. There was a special interest for fungicides due to the cool temperatures and higher rainfall in May and June. In a lot of the province, the rainfall in July tapered off, but the soil was still humid and conditions were still conducive to disease development. So this will be a theme going forward for all the fungicide trials. And so we ended up with more fungicide trials than normal, with about 20% of the program. We had 3 soybean, 9 field pea, and 4 dry bean fungicide trials this year. We'll now start in on the 2024 soybean fungicide trials. This trial type is comparing a single application of foliar fungicide versus none. And we are looking at the effect of a single application of fungicide on disease pressure and on yield. At all of these trials, there was a lot of rainfall in May and June and tapered off a bit in July, but the conditions were still great for disease. All 3 trials compared a single application of Delero to untreated at the start of flowering or R1. Diseases were rated 14 days after the application, and while we did find some Septoria brown spot at all sites, frog eye leaf spot at 2 sites, and northern stem canker at 1 site, notably, we did not find any white mold at any of the sites. Disease pressure was similar between soybeans that received a foliar fungicide and those without. And so despite the real potential for a response to fungicide this year, there were no significant yield responses for a single foliar fungicide on soybeans. This resulted in a loss in profit per acre of about $20 per acre for the product. Over the long term, we've had 71 single versus non-soybean fungicide trials since 2014. A single application of fungicide improved yield at these 71 trials 15% of the time. Of these, an average yield improved by 1.3 bushels per acre. But economically speaking, only 8% of the soybean fungicide trials had significant yield responses and resulted in increased profits, considering an average fungicide cost of approximately $20 per acre and $12 per bushel soybean selling price. White mold pressure has typically been low in these trials, but where there have been larger yield responses or greater than 2 bushels per acre, white mold was present and the severity was reduced with the fungicide treatment. I'll note that typically applying fungicide to soybean is not a normal practice or even economic. This is thankfully due to soybeans' low susceptibility to disease pressure. Most diseases except white mold do not cause yield loss. Therefore, farmers will make a decision to spray or not based on the white mold risk at flowering, or R1. So at flowering, you want to assess if it's warm around 15 to 25 degrees Celsius with 1 to 2 inches of rain within 1 to 2 weeks of flowering. You want to see how thick the canopy is, the crop rotation with a susceptible host, for example, canola, dry beans, or sunflower, and what is the disease history of the field. Moving on to pea fungicide trials. In 2024, 6 trials compared a single fungicide applied at flowering versus none, and 3 trials compared a double application to a single application. The questions we want to answer are, what is the fungicide's application's effect on the disease pressure and on yield? And I will note that this year we installed 4 weather stations at pea fungicide trials to enhance our capabilities of understanding how weather conditions affect disease development. For the 6 single versus none trials, the products tested were Delero, Cotegra, Zetigo, PRM, and ReviPro. And they were all applied at flowering time between R2 to R3. R2 is pictured left, and R3 is pictured on the right. The picture on the left, we had a lot of standing water in some of the fields. Ascochyta and Mycospora blight, or I'll abbreviate to AM blight from now on, continued to be the most common foliar disease observed in field peas, and it was prevalent at all of our sites. So this is the main disease we're targeting with the fungicide. We rated the trials 10 to 14 days after application, and we were finding symptoms anywhere from the purple freckles pictured left to more severe symptoms on the right, where the disease is moving up the canopy, causing weak stems and lodging. So AM blight is Ascochyta and Mycosporella. In the table on the side going up is the severity scale, where 1 to 7, where 7 is more severe. And on the bottom are the different trials. Across all products tested, the single fungicide application reduced AM blight severity at 5 out of 6 trials. But there were no significant yield responses to a single application of foliar fungicide applied at flowering and peas in 2024. Therefore, a loss in profit of about $15 to $20 per acre occurred. So long-term pea fungicide one versus none trials, we've had 38 trials since 2017. 26% of the time these applications were significant and economic, increasing pea yield by 5.8 bushels per acre on average. It's good to note that the severity of the AM blight foliar infections decreased at 56% of trials, and the stem AM infections were reduced at 41% of trials. Moving on to 3 double versus single pea fungicide trials in 2024, we tested Acapella plus ReviPro to Acapella alone, Delero plus Zytigo PRM to Delero alone, and Moravis Neo plus Delero to Moravis Neo. Again, we rated the plants for disease 10 to 14 days after application. Let's see what happened. And across all products, we saw a reduction in foliar severity of AM blight in 2 out of the 3 trials with the double application. But no significant yield responses in 2024 for a double application compared to a single application, and a loss of $30 to $40 per acre occurred for the 2 treatments. And it's a bit hard to say why exactly there were no yield responses to pea fungicides this year. Just speculating here, but we did have severe lodging at several trials, and this may have reduced coverage lower in the canopy. And at single versus none trials, perhaps the single application was not enough to provide control past the efficacy window for the longer lasting human conditions. But that doesn't help us to explain the lack of response to the double versus single trials. I guess just because we see symptoms doesn't mean we will always see a yield response. Long-term data, we've had 21 double versus single pea fungicide trials since 2017, and 33% have been significant and economical. Average yield gains from the second application were 5.1 bushels per acre on average. Pea fungicide recommendations. So in late June and July, or stages V10 to R2, begin scouting the peas for freckling symptoms of AM blight in the lower canopy. If there is no disease and it's dry, you may be able to hold off spraying. Fine-tune decisions using our fungicide decision worksheet to assess the disease risk. Fungicide timing is important to contain the disease in the lower canopy. The pea fungicide decision worksheet is a useful tool to gauge disease risk, and it's available on our website. We also have versions for soybean and dry bean. Basically, you go through the worksheet to get a score. If you get a score over 65, then an application is warranted. Try it out. Lastly, dry bean fungicide trials, same research questions as other fungicide trials. What's the effect of fungicide on disease pressure and on yield? This year we had 3 single fungicide application versus none trials in dry bean. 2 trials tested Zolera FX and 1 tested Diax. 1 trial compared 2 fungicide applications versus 1 application, and the products involved were Proline Gold and ReviPro. For the single versus none trials, the application stage of the 2 trials was beginning of pod, or R2, which is pictured left, so early to mid bloom, and 1 trial was sprayed at R4, or full pod, pictured right, but this stage is probably a little late for good activity on white mold. If only 1 application is taking place, it should happen closer to early mid bloom, or R1 to R3. At the double versus single trial, the first application took place at beginning pod, R2, and once again at full pod, or R4. For dry bean diseases, primarily For white mold development, dry rainfall is key when the crop is starting to flower. Dry rainfall was dropping below normal at 3 out of the 4 sites, but conditions were still conducive to disease development, and we definitely saw this in our ratings. Diseases were rated 10 to 14 days after application. At the one site, DBFO2, we had a higher percentage of plants with white mold, and at DBFO3, we had some white mold, but less so. White mold severity was low to moderate at both sites. This is pictured in the orange boxes. At DBFO2, white mold incidence was slightly decreased with a single fungicide application. But there were no significant yield responses to fungicide applications in 2024, and this resulted in a decrease in profit equal to the cost of the product. As for an explanation, why we didn't see any yield responses, well, at DBFO2, where we saw higher levels of white mold, the product was probably applied a little late for good suppression. And at the other 3 trials, disease pressure may not have been high enough for us to see a response. Over the long term, since 2016, we've had 21 one fungicide application versus none trials, and 2 double versus single trials. A single application of foliar fungicide improved dry bean yield and provided a return on investment at 2 trials, or only 10% of the time. And where significant yield was increased by 165 to 175 pounds per acre. And a small sample size, but 2 applications have not improved yield compared to 1 application. Recommendations for dry bean fungicide use. Dry bean fungicide timing is a little different than for peas, where with peas you want to wait to see the symptoms, but in dry beans you want to spray before symptoms appear. Assess your white mold risk just before or at flowering to inform your decision. And consider the crop rotation, the weather around flowering, the canopy thickness, how humid it is, and the white mold infection history of the field. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you all for listening. If you're interested in running a trial next season with us and need ideas, here is a list. And if you have a different trial idea in mind, that's great. So please reach out to me. Special thanks to all the On-Farm Network trial participants. This research is driven by you. Big thank you to our contractors, Tone Ag, New Era Ag, and Green Arrow. Thank you to all MPSG staff at Ag Canada, Manitoba Agriculture, and Assiniboine College. And lastly, thank you to our sponsors, BASF, UPL, Bayer, and Corteva. You can see our trial database links here, and please follow me on X.